All right, and welcome back. This is the eighth week. We're talking about the book 12 Rules for Life. This is rule number 8. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. I think for me personally, this is probably one of the rules I struggle with the most. There's a quote in this chapter that Dr. Peterson takes from, I think, John Milton or Milton John or whatever his name is. He's the guy who wrote Paradise Lost. And he
Yeah.
says, like, the prideful mind falls in love with its own creations. Like, when I hear something like that, it's sort of, when you hear the context that it's, like, speaking from, obviously he's talking about, like, Satan and God and their relationship, right? And it's kind of hard for it to see like that within yourself, especially like if you're not aware of how many lies you tell yourself. And then there comes a time in, I suppose, your life, or at least my life, I'm like, wow, like there's so many things that I don't understand, especially about myself, and things that I don't know, and I keep making the same mistakes. I'm like, oh shit, like I've been lying to myself for a really long time. And when you start uncovering those things, you start to see like how easy it is to just tell those little white lies to yourself, or like to other people. And then the more you do that to other people, the more you start believing some of them too. And for me, that's kind of scary. So because of that, I suppose this is like the hardest one for me to sort of not just wrap my head around, but also like carry out in practice. Because telling the truth isn't easy.
Oh, I think it's also the one that's easiestly, it's not even a word. um, to like miss because you kind of like just rationalize something where you're like, oh, like I'm maybe just overreacting to a situation, or I'm not doing something specifically because of some other reason, and you don't really realize it as lying necessarily, but it's like I said, you kind of rationalize it or intellectualize it or something where you're like, oh, I did this because of this reason, or this person wasn't really like this because of this and this. Almost like you're in an abusive relationship with yourself where you're trying to like gaslight yourself into doing something else.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And for me, the most interesting part of that, or the part of it that's like sort of the scariest, is that sometimes like you're so good at lying to yourself that you don't even know that you're doing it, right? Like
Hmm.
it's the unconscious lies that you act out within the world, that you internally believe to be true, but on some level within like your unconscious, you're like, yeah, I know this isn't the case, you know? So for me, that's
Hmm.
like just being a kind person, like it's sometimes like throughout my childhood or whatever, I always fancied myself as like, oh, this really nice like boy who um, just wanted to do right by others, and wanted to be kind just for the sake of kindness. And then somewhere along the way, like I started telling myself like I kept telling myself that, and then I kind of deluded myself into like precluding myself from even being able to have the conversation of just, oh, I think Siri is talking to me. Hold on, let me turn that off. Yeah, so you just start having these conversations with yourself, and then it's like, oh, I'm doing this because I want to be nice. And then, like, years later, you're like, oh, I was doing this because I was expecting something in return. Or a lot of the things that I was doing was conditional on the expectations of other people. And then after that, it's sort of like, well, shit. If I want to do something nice for someone, is it really me just trying to be nice, or am I doing this with like an end goal in mind of, oh, I hope they help me out in the future?
Yeah. And I think we had this conversation back with one about having friends that like want the best for you, and we were talking about how like how do you determine, I think it was that rule, how do you determine like, oh, I'm going to the like soup kitchen, not to just be like, oh, look at me, I go to the soup kitchen, but rather like, oh, I actually want to help people,
Mm.
or you have discussions to sound intelligent, or you do certain things to show off to other people rather than being like actually you. Um, Stuff like that where I think you're just not, a lot of it's not being your authentic self just to either put on an air to make friends or make yourself look better than you actually are.
Right. So that I think that brings up another question of what is your like authentic self? Because I feel as though
Yeah.
when people say authentic self, like I don't always know what that means. Because like when I think I understand what they're trying to say, but when you just look at like sort of the true meaning of what that is, like if I were to ask myself like what is my authentic self, I think like number one, even just the way it's described, or like the way the language of authentic self is almost sort of poor. Like it's almost more. I think a more accurate way of saying it or putting it is like what's my like what's my inherent nature? Like what are my proclivities, or what are things that I feel naturally inclined to do, despite like my own force of will. So when I think of that, I
Yeah.
think I think this is where Jordan Peterson's like theory of both chaos and order is a little easier to like sort of superimpose onto that mode of thinking, because in this chapter he says, oh, things fall apart, so it's always better to sacrifice who you are now so who you can be can like live and thrive, right? It's sort of like the
Yeah.
realization of potential. But then sometimes you're also like, oh, my most authentic self is just to remain the same. And then also
Yeah.
like there's an aspect of myself that doesn't mind watching like the world burn, or like doesn't mind like just seeing if I could just throw my entire life away doing stupid shit. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's kind of weird because I think what people say like in conversation as their authentic self is almost more so like what they want other people to perceive their quote unquote authentic self is, rather than what's my like natural tendency.
Yeah. I was about to say, I think that's like, there's like two, I tend to see issues with the whole authentic self thing is one, the people use it as an excuse to not better themselves, where,
Very
they're like,
interesting.
oh, this is just me. I see it a lot with the whole, that's why I hate this like kind of internet style of personality, that whole I'm just a bad bitch like kind of person. I think I see it a lot in like kind of beauty model people where they're just like, I'm a bad bitch. And it's like, no, you're just being an asshole to everyone around you. Like, or they're like, I'm a strong, independent woman. And it's like, no, it looks more to me like you're making excuses for just not being a good person and blaming it on being yourself, or those people who are like, I'm a whatever star sign, and that's why I push people away and like don't let stuff like that. Where
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah,
I
it's
think
it
I
that
think
that's
there.
strange.
Sorry.
No, you're good. Sorry, I cut you off. I was just interjecting. I was like, yeah, that's weird, but like you're so right.
Yeah, yeah. Where I think you have to strike a balance where, like you said, you have to find like what's your natural proclivity, but also which one of those are actually weaknesses and need to be improved versus strengths you want to nurture.
Interesting. So, do you think it's worth, if we were to continue using such a phrase as like our authentic self? Do you think that really is something that's like even relevant, or even like something of like that, a statement that holds value? Do you think it's even worth saying, oh, what my authentic self is? Because sometimes I feel as though it's almost like a sort of shortcoming then. So in your example of mentioning like, oh, these internet personalities being like, oh, I'm a bad bitch and I do whatever the fuck I want, like I'm not gonna have like nobody, no man, no woman tell me what to do or whatever the fuck. It's like to me when I hear something like that, I got alarms going off in my head. I'm like, if I have to like sit down and have a dinner with this person, like I might rip my eyes out. Like
Yeah.
like it's almost sort of like you know exactly what you're going to get into when you engage in such a conversation, because the likelihood of them understanding like anytime you have an opinion that differs from theirs is probably going to be like, there's a really low chance that they'll be willing to hear you out. just because their own like sense of self is like placed upon this pedestal of, oh, I'm perfect, I don't need to change, the world has to change before me. It's like that same sort of mentality where it's like, if you can't accept me at my worst, then you don't deserve me at my best. And it's like, yeah, that's just an excuse for being like a prick and not accepting responsibility. So like, along that vein, is it even worth having a conversation of, or trying to acknowledge what our authentic self is, do you think?
I think it is a useful term. I just think typically what happens in kind of the cultural zeitgeist is we go one way or the other, and maybe right now we are have a little swung a little into more of the authentic self is being who I am rather than who I could be almost. Which
Mm.
because I was just thinking now, yeah, it I really hate the phrase my truth because I see it used all the time to just dispose of arguments that disagree with your view, and you're like, this is my truth, so you can't disagree with it because it's my truth. And which is really just a lot of emotional reasoning, which leads to issues where you feel a certain way, so therefore that is the truth, which I do want to get into a little bit, like what
Mm.
is truth, which is a
Yes,
massive
yes.
that's a massive conversation. But still going along this line, I think it is useful because but it's more of a tool rather than a goal, I would say. And a lot of times I think
Mm.
what happens is people have a tool, but rather than using it as a tool, they use it as the goal. So it's like, oh, I want to be my authentic self, and rather than using that, be like, okay, who am I, and like reflecting on themselves for good or bad, they go,
Mm.
I'm going to think about who am I as a person and be that person that I currently am, or who I think I am, at least without the reflection.
So you believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but you believe it's more meaningful to use your term of authentic self more so as a barometer to guide the direction that you want to manifest, like the ideal self that you've created in your mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of like, yeah, thinking about rather using the authentic self as more of a who am I right now, and comparing it to an ideal, which I think I made note of it. Yeah, it was on page. I mean, on my page, I'm sure they're all different books, but he like goes into something we've talked about in the past too about um, how you set your ambitions. Which I liked the quote. The better ambitions have to do with the development of character and ability rather than status and power. So kind of that reflecting inward on your character and being like, oh, who am I? Where am I and my authentic self? What are the weaknesses in my authentic self? And what are the strengths? And like I said
Mm.
earlier, fixing your weaknesses and improving your strengths
Right.
rather
So
than,
I see.
I think we've circled it around a couple times, but rather not being, this is who I am, so I'm going to make excuses.
Right. So you sort of accept like both good and disposable parts of your authentic self, such that you can
Yeah.
still like manifest like the ideal self, or like say
Mm,
the version of yourself that you wish to manifest. That's really
yeah.
interesting. I think like when and to go back to a point that you mentioned earlier, when you say something about like when people are talking like you, I think you hear this more so in in like relationships where it's like, oh, I'm gonna tell my truth or something like that. Like I
Yeah.
think when people, it's almost like a sort of like shorthand, in my opinion, when I hear people say something like that, like they throw around the term like my truth or my story. I think what they try to do is that they try to. Well, let's paraphrase it. Actually, I think the best possible way to make that sentence make more sense is like people say that to give their opinion and emotion the 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 moral weight of like objective truth,
Yeah.
right? Because inevitably, regardless of who you are, as long as you're a human being, you sort of live within your own, you live within walls of your own illusions that you've sort of defined as truth, right? So that's the same reason
Yeah.
why, like, I think that the paradigm of chaos and order is still so important, especially within the context of this chapter, because it's like even if you've surrounded yourself with like these edifices of truth, or like these definitions of truth that you've uh, known to be cogent for like your entire life, there's always like that slim possibility that that can all come crumbling down just by like the revelation of one small thing, right? So I
Yeah.
think a good example of that could be like, oh, you lived your entire life like with like parents that loved and cared about you, and then like when you're 23, they're just like, oh, you were adopted, you know,
Yeah.
and now it's like your entire like sense of self, your sense of community, and like even just traditional senses of like definitions of love and truth are all just now shattered.
Yeah.
So I think when people are talking like that, I feel as though the conversation becomes less so one about truth when they say my truth. The conversation becomes less so defined or geared towards like discovering the meaning of truth, and it becomes more a game of, oh, this is how I feel, and like I want someone to acknowledge that my feelings are like validated somehow,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. Because I think there's two types of people that kind of use this. I think there's the people who are consciously manipulating terms like truth and what is true for the pure sake of like power games, or like gaining something out of a conversation or winning an argument or whatever. And then there's the people who are kind of like two steps removed from there, where they're kind of in those circles and they don't realize that they're not looking for truth. And it can be really painful to kind of look at yourself and realize there's some aspects of yourself that aren't true, or you're feeling a certain way. Um, kind of like the person, like you said, the person who's been adopted and they've thought they had loving parents this whole time. Well, they did have loving parents. It's just that the truth of the situation is they weren't biological parents, but there's still like the truth in there that they had two loving parents,
Mm.
so that you can kind of look at the truth and still deal with reality as it is, but there's still a sort of, I guess it's not even a metaphorical truth, it's an actual truth that they had actual still had loving parents, they just weren't biologicals.
Right. I
um
think
that's why I like.
sorry, continue.
Oh, I was gonna say, I was just, it's kind of like I see the biggest issue with that my truth kind of argument with the overuse of the Me Too kind of movement, where you see these
Mm.
kind of borderline cases. There's like the obvious cases of Harvey Weinstein, but then I think there's some comedian guy where a woman and like him, they were like fooling around, and I think they did like oral sex and stuff, and then she didn't want to go any further and she left. And she said she felt uncomfortable the whole time, but she never expressed that to him. If
I
you
think
like
that was
listen to the
Aziz
story,
Ansari, right?
yeah, yeah, cases like that where either they've post hoc changed how they felt about the situation and they're regretting it, now they're trying to change the truth of the situation, or they're not accepting the reality that
Right.
they
Right.
didn't clearly say no, um, which then they have to just accept that they weren't assertive enough. I think that's where I have the biggest issue with the kind of my truth kind of crowd.
Yeah, I think the strange thing about Me Too is that like I think Bill Burr like made a comment about that too once, where there's like a slogan going around for a while where it's like believe all women. And then Bill Burr
Mm.
makes this joke of like all of them, like all the time too. And he's like, what about the ones that like key your car, or like put the family pet in a bowl of soup or something? It's like, should we still believe them? And it's kind of strange because like people will take these sort of I don't know what the term is, but they'll take these like very like catchy phrases, or like these very catchy slogans, and then manipulate it into distorting the truth for like the expediency of their own benefit. So like when it comes
Yep.
to something like that, I think and on the other side, it's also like a very complicated issue too, because I think I remember it typically happens around comedians, I think, and it's kind of weird because like comedians sort of like exist on the margins of society where it's like we don't know if this
Mm.
is like politically like correct versus like, oh, like is this actually a problem slash menace to society? Like you remember that that saga of Louis C.K. where he was asking like women if he could like jerk off in front of them.
Yeah.
And then like sometimes like the girls would laugh, but they would never like explicitly say no or something. But the fact
Yeah.
that he's like this big burly dude, kind of like almost sort of like it's like the, if you've ever seen like what's it? It's Always Sunny in Philly. It's like the implication, right? Like
Yeah.
the women are never aren't in any actual danger, but it's like the implication of danger that makes the situation like
Mm.
dangerous in like their
Yeah.
minds. So when the option of saying no actually like enters the table, because for the most part, and I would say probably like 99% of all cases, this tends to be true, is that like women are just physically and like in terms of like strength and stature just smaller than men, so there's always
Yeah.
going to be that sort of dynamic too. But at the same time, it's also like if you operate under this paradigm of, oh, you can never say no out of fear of physical danger, then it's also like, well, what's the point of even having like any sort of like these types of conversations um where like you have to gain like explicit consent or whatever, because now you've already like concluded that explicit, like even obtaining explicit consent is dangerous. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of strange. It's almost like we want to have our cake and eat it too. We want to be able to
Yeah.
like claim the status of like these protected groups without having the conversation. I don't know. It's so strange.
Yeah, I think because I think what the solution to that situation would be, and I think what this chapter would kind of say is like, oh, you have to look at the underlying truth and the reality of the situation to adequately deal with an issue. Because I think I've seen this all the time. I think I've seen a couple clips of Destiny complaining about this a lot, where you'll go on these like Reddit threads and people just kind of straight up lie to you about reality, where people want to manifest a universe where there's like an ideal utopia that they want to manifest, and instead of like dealing with current reality, they they talk and give advice as if we are in their ideal universe where you see the people complaining. It's like, oh, women are afraid to walk alone in dark parking lots at night where there's no security or anything around. Or it's like, well, yeah, no shit, because there's on average smaller and weaker than men. So yeah, is a danger, but they'll give advice almost like, well, reality shouldn't be this way. So we have to teach men not to rape. And it's like, well,
Mm.
that's not going to work, because obviously men who rape know rape is wrong.
Yeah, it's
But
like just being
you have
told to not rape people isn't enough to
yeah,
stop rapists.
yeah, yeah. So I think because I think the a recent example I saw a little bit ago was like there'll be people where they'll like go on Reddit and be like, "Oh, I'm like," they'll like post like a selfie and be like actually unattractive, and people will be like, "Oh no, you're great. You're so attractive." Like, and it's like people aren't realizing the reality of the situation. It's like, "Oh no, like you need a better haircut, or you need to go to the gym because you're fat." Like stuff like that. Or it'll be like, "Oh, like I went up to his apartment and stuff, and like I didn't push back on him, and then he expected sex from me." And it's like, well, what were you thinking would happen if he invites you up to his like one bedroom apartment and into his bedroom, and you're sitting on the bed kissing? Like, what do you think he was expecting? Like, there's a reality of the situation. Obviously he's not entitled to sex, but you've been giving off all of these signals that this is
Right.
where it's going, and then he gets upset because you didn't like keep going with all those signals.
Right.
So there's like, go ahead.
I think when it comes to something like that, like Dr. Peterson even like talks about it in this chapter too, and he does several other times too. And it's like the idea of saying no, right? He says
Mm,
early, like really early on in the chapter, where it's like if you start to say no when you should say no, it's like then that is
yeah.
actually taken more seriously. So let's take like this hypothetical situation of like this man and a woman are on this date. It's not going well, but it's also not going like so poorly that it's like the worst experience ever, right? So they just keep going along with it, and then eventually, one way or another, the more opportunities she finds to say no, but doesn't actually say no to, the deeper of a hole she digs herself in, right? Because the
Yeah.
guy's probably thinking, oh, this date's going really well. She's not like like in any obvious distress, or like she doesn't seem like she just hates like the experience, you know. And then
Yeah.
it's like sometimes it's better to just have that conversation of just, hey, I'm not really feeling it, versus like, oh, 3 hours later we're going on this walk, and it just so happens to be like
Yeah.
going back towards someone's apartment or whatever. Now it's really hard to say no, right? And
Mm.
I feel as though that's also something like girls generally have a hard time doing. Like, I can't tell you how
Yeah.
many times I've had conversations with girls, and I'll just be like like, have you ever ghosted anyone? And they'll just be like, yeah. And then I'm like, how do you feel about it? And then they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, have you ever been ghosted? And they're like, yeah, it makes me feel like crap, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm just like, well, why would you do that to someone else then too? And it's sort of weird, because it's like this sort of it's this sort of like difficulty in telling the truth. It's not even just like
Yeah.
not avoiding lies, but it's the difficulty of like staving off a worse or a more difficult future by having an uncomfortable present moment right now.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think Peterson also talks about too in this chapter is that like sometimes like when you get restraining orders for people, like the rules surrounding like restraining orders are only effective for people that don't need restraining orders, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is really funny, because it's also like that point that you brought up early in this chapter, where it's like, oh, it's not enough to just say rape is wrong and you shouldn't do it, right? Because that's
Yeah.
not going to stop a rapist, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's weird, because you sort of ride this like this boundary of trying to discover what's not just what is true, but like also what's proper. And I suppose that's like the layer that is sort of like sort of sits above the truth. Because sometimes like the truth isn't. I wouldn't say the truth isn't necessary, but I think I suspect that's why the second clause of like what this chapter is titled is necessary for, because you can't always be
Yeah.
expected to always tell the truth, right? But you can at least not make like falsehoods, or like
Yeah.
diminish the value of your speech, or of your words, or of your of your perspective.
Yeah. And it's typically you may not know the truth, but you can at least know what is an actual lie, if you would say that, which I think is why that tagline's there. Because you may not know exactly why you did something or why something happened, but at least you know why some. At least you know how. What's the inverse? Like you at least know why you didn't do another thing or something else like that. Where I think that's why it's tagged on there. Like you said, it's really easy not to lie. It may be hard to tell the truth. Um,
Hmm.
and I think going back to that kind of utopian vision thing, I think that's why he brought up kind of in the middle there, or I should say, where was it? It was kind of first first half. I want to say I read this in two sittings, so like the Solzhenitsyn part where people want to manifest this destiny, this utopian world so badly that they kind of have to lie to themselves about the reality of a
Hmm.
situation right now. Um, which I think that's kind of what happened in like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and stuff, where people are lying to themselves about like achieving this goal that eventually you get you've been lying to yourself so long that it's one the truth and two you and b you're willing to do anything to kind of get to that truth.
Hmm.
um, which I think is kind of what he was trying to get into. I can't remember where it was, but I was been trying to think about that kind of that making of a truth that's not dealing with reality on a bigger scale. Um,
Hmm.
which I think because I listened to a podcast this week about a little about Cambodia and what happened there, and just a lot of it was just people lying to each other or terrible things happening in essence for their truth, but not in reality. So they're like, oh, we're just gonna make all these people farmers and put them on communes, and the utopia will come. Well, it's like it just doesn't work like that. So you're kind of lying to yourself about how the world works on a massive scale, and then millions die.
Right,
You know?
because I think when it comes to something like that, especially if it's like something from the perspective of like geopolitical history, that's like one of those instances. Well, that's an instance where like the slippery slope really does come to be true, and I think it's true
Mm,
just because of the fundamental nature of like human beings, right? Because like we
yeah.
all have desires, and there's obviously like futures that we each try to like manifest or like try to bring forth into reality too, right? And sometimes like especially when you're having like difficult when you encounter difficult social situations, like not you can't expect like the majority. Let me rephrase that. It's hard to expect everyone in the world, or at least half of the people in the world, to be able to call out a bad situation for what it is. It's the entire reason why like the pedestrian effect or whatever it's called is like a thing. You know, when someone cries for help, but it's in like the middle of like this neighborhood where you know everyone is listening. It's like no one's gonna come to respond to that, and it's like if it persists, then you're just gonna have this world where chaos runs free, and then people are allowed to do whatever the fuck they want. You know, and sometimes people are too weak or too or they're not bold enough to come forward and like say the truth or stand up for what's actually right, you know. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem primarily because I feel like we've become really lazy when it comes to just identifying what the truth is. Some people believe science is true, like that science must be true, and science must be like the end all be all of like of like just objective truth, when in reality science is more so like a tool to be used to discover objective truth, right? It's not objective truth in and of itself. And I think the instance you start to see sort of that tool being warped, being used to warp like the fabric of reality, is when you see things like these major news companies talking about like the I think I sent you this video earlier this week where it's like major news company talking about like the necessity of vaccines, but also demonizing like the experiences or like the opinions of like people that are like refusing to get these vaccines to begin with, right? It's undeniable like the data that exists that supports like the necessity of these vaccines in terms of overcoming tremendous death and also like poor health outcomes in like communities. But it's another thing to just dismiss like the opinions of other people that don't want to get the vaccine, right? So I
Yeah.
think it's weird because on one hand, as like someone who studied science for a while, like I get that perspective, but also like I've lived like a significant period of my life with people that are sort of like on the other side of the aisle too, where it's like, oh, my freedoms are more important, blah blah
Yeah.
blah. It's weird because you start to see like the narrative getting flipped too, where it's like the right, the I wouldn't say right, but like people of a certain like political ideology that aren't necessarily a fan of abortion will start saying like, "Oh, my body, my choice." You know,
Yeah.
so it's so crazy because like these same tools just get like warped and then twisted into like serving a different narrative too, and it makes sense. I think that's the worst part.
Yeah.
So because of that, it's even more important right now to like understand or like be dedicated to having conversations geared towards discovering truth, or at least things that are more true than things that we know to be like more plagued with falsehood.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say I was thinking of that too, kind of this whole past 2 years now about kind of COVID stuff where there's kind of this scientism going on where I think people are using data to drive a like a goal and science and truth to drive a goal rather than having the actual conversation I think people are trying to have. So there was like, yeah, you can show that like masks can work and lockdowns may decrease disease, but like at what cost? And I think what happens is people, rather than having that discussion of like, oh, what's the risk and benefits of shutting down and doing total lockdowns and quarantines and stuff, versus the like economic damage that happens, or the mental health issues that happen and stuff like that. No one's having that conversation because they're using the data point that, oh, we've decreased X number of cases in this area that didn't have a lock, or that did have a lockdown versus didn't. So rather than like having a honest conversation and like kind of telling the whole truth, they take an aspect of truth and use that to drive what they think is best or what they want to accomplish.
Right, and I think going off of that point too is that the a lot of times like lies aren't just like, oh, there's a unicorn that exists like in the sky that grants all your wishes. It's
Mm-hmm.
usually something a lot more so consistent with you've taken a fraction of truth and you've like distorted the edges, like you've pushed their limits, like sort of into the boundaries of, oh, this isn't entirely like true anymore, or you don't observe this within reality anymore.
Yeah.
So there's always the flavor of truth within like just about every good lie, you know. And
Yeah.
I think
That's kind of,
yeah, I think when you're talking about data too, that's another thing too, right? Because I think this is always tradition. Well, historically, this has always been an issue within like the sciences as well, especially like as science exists within the West. A lot of science is driven by like paper publications, funding needs to be granted somehow through these different granting entities to people that are applying for grants and all that good stuff. Like, that being said, data is just data, right? And it's up
yeah.
to human beings to interpret the data and create this sort of like meta narrative for why this data came to be, and then not only why it came to be, but how we can replicate it and what direction this can go moving forward. Like, that's the basis of science. And the crazy thing
Yeah.
too is that like when I hear people talking about like the proponents of science, or like they're just adherents to like it's almost like the church of science, you know. And
Yeah.
it's like, oh, but if only we interpret the data differently, or if only we interpreted like the data the right way. And it's kind of strange because it's really strange because like sometimes you hear that from like people that are very religious too. Like, you just sort of switched, like you've removed the labels and then just put like different stickers on the talking point. You know, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
if only we interpreted the Bible correctly. Oh, if we interpreted the Communist
Yeah.
Manifesto or Marxism correctly, you know, we wouldn't be in this situation. And it's
It,
crazy because like it's that same idea where the rational mind falls in love with its own creation. We've constructed like these ideas within our heads to be to be so self-evidently true that the only solution is to give whoever is like the propagator or the progenitor of such ideas like the reins to
yeah.
whatever it is that's necessary to bring forward utopia. And then that's how totalitarianism comes about.
Yeah. I think, yeah, because I was gonna say, I think it's because, oh shit, I totally lost my train of thought. But before, I think the most obvious example on that, like interpreting data differently, and both is both sides are technically true, but there's a oh, I don't know, what I was gonna say, there's like a value judgment where should we like fund science, or how do we use science? Like I was saying earlier, yeah, you may save X many lives, but at what cost? And there's still a value judgment there, even though we have actual data. Um, but I was going to say, I think the biggest example of taking data and interpreting it, tech, both sides are technically correct in their interpretation of data, but they come to vastly different examples, is um, racial disparities in crime statistics. So you look at them, and the typically the right says, "Oh, look at, like, oh, more black people are shot by cops per year compared to their population. Why is that? Oh, it's because black people commit more crimes." It's that, I think it's like, it's just the meme of saying 1350 or whatever it is. It's like 13% of the population commit 50% of violent crimes. Um, but then on the left, they say, "Oh, look at it this way. Oh, there's more black people being shot in proportion to their population, which is 13%." So both sides are like technically right in interpreting data, but the value they place on two different data points has like a vastly different outcome and how they interpret the world and the solution to a problem.
Yeah, I think also because of that, it sort of reiterates the necessity for the existence of both like like the political right and left, you know?
Hmm.
Because just the mere existence of one of those like predominating narratives is like sort of
Yeah.
insufficient to tell the entire story. Because it's like, yeah, on one hand, it is like a certain fraction of a certain population that's committing a certain type of crime, and then on the other hand too, it's like what are the factors that facilitate that into existence, or like
Yeah.
why does this exist, like why have the why have these sorts of landmarks or like these metrics fallen like the way that they have, or like why did they exist. And then I think the problem that everyone try to answer prematurely is, well, what can we do about this too, without asking like the right questions first, right? Because sometimes it's not enough to just offer to like just spitball and brainstorm a bunch of answers when you don't even know what the goddamn question is, you know.
Yeah.
And it's a tragedy too, because like when you look at either side, you understand, like if you take a second to like really put yourself in their shoes, you can really understand like where they come from when it comes to like these issues. Oh, it's like, oh, we should instate affirmative action, or like initiate reparations for
Mm.
like like for previous crimes or wronghoods committed of
Yeah.
people of certain racial like identities. And it's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Like, and I understand like you're trying to help like these people that are dispossessed, but on the other hand, it's like the people of today aren't the people that committed these crimes like decades or
Mm.
like centuries ago. So is that
Yeah.
even really a relevant conversation to have anymore? Because whatever price there is to pay, someone has to pay it, right? Or for whatever
Yeah.
benefit there is to society. Jordan says this all the time too, where it's like, your rights are my responsibility. You know, things don't just come free, right? So
Yeah.
it's difficult, because on one hand it's like compassion, but on the other hand it's also like this twisting of compassion that becomes almost sort of like social engineering. And it's like, why are you doing this in
Yeah.
the first place?
I think too sometimes when you're not like I think for one, I was gonna say I think that's probably why the next rule is assume the person you were listening to might not know some might know something you don't. I think we keep talking about that, like how other people might have different perspectives, and it's like, oh, it's probably why these rules are right next to each other because they probably build off each other really well. But yeah, like if you want to think of an example where it's like, oh, we need affirmative action in like PhDs or whatever, so we need like an equal proportion of sometimes that's like you get that they get that so stuck in their heads where it needs to be exactly proportioned to the population or whatever, and they're not. So therefore the solution is, oh, we just need to make a racial quota, whereas the actual answer might be, oh, so why are there less of a certain group of people going and getting PhDs? Is it like a cultural reason? Is it educational reason? And you go, oh, it's because they live in a poor area and their grade school sucked, which put them behind from the gate. So the actual answer isn't take the students who aren't going to do well as a PhD right now, but it's go fix the grade schools so that in the future, in a couple like 20 years, we'll actually have equal footing for getting people into college and it'll be better, better outcomes that way.
I suspect another issue that also arises too is sort of this idea of people, of especially people within academia, because for the listeners right now, both Squeers and I are currently like sort of in like these postgraduate programs. So we've been in sort of academia for a really long time, and I think historically the issue that's always plagued individuals within academia is that we sort of live in these senses of like ivory towers. So a lot of the things we discuss are like several degrees removed from sometimes like even just the reality of certain situations. Like when we say something like, oh, we have to change some aspect of like preschool or kindergarten or grade school or anything like that. and you sort of look in these communities where like these people just come up in general, and it's like no one wants to live in these communities, let alone work in them, right? So it's like
Yeah.
it's almost like which problem do we solve first? The problem of like the chicken not being able to get fertilized, or the egg not being able to get fertilized, or like the hen is just ugly as fuck and no one wants to like jizz on the eggs. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
it's like there's so many problems that have to be like tackled on so many different levels, and that's the exact problem with like that's like one of the biggest problems right now because it's unscientific. Like when you take like the scientific method, the ideal design of an experiment is, we maintain all aspects of a certain problem or a certain paradigm as constant. We change one variable, and then we observe over a period of time how it changes. And it's like we can't do one of that because the existence of other problems precludes that from even being a realistic solution, let alone like even a solution that we can like throw money into, you know? So
Yeah.
when people offer solutions like that, it's like so hard to get behind too, because it's like, okay, yes, on one hand that is true, but on the other hand there's so many other factors that would just probably even prevent that from being like financially feasible or even just viable in
Yep.
general. And it's such a it's just an absolute tragedy, right? Because we're stuck in limbo effectively, because we can't just institute these changes and expect a favorable outcome without being realistic about the problems of reality, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah. I think you said it earlier, but I went back and I've been listening on my commute to his old Maps of Meaning lectures, and he talked about, or it might have been an old 12 Rules lecture. It was about ideologies, and no, I think it was. Anyways, I think it was the first Maps of Meaning lecture that I finished this week, where he talked about how a lot of these ideologies are true in a sense, but they're only partially true. It's kind of that old metaphor of the blind men and the elephant, where they all have like an aspect of truth and they think that's the whole truth and they don't run with it, which I think, again, when he was talking about, like the gulags and stuff and why people are being driven, there's like a truth there and it is true, but they can only see from that kind of one aspect. And I think like a good, like two recent examples I've kind of seen, which I made notes while I was reading, is we're recording this on September 12th, and so obviously yesterday was 9/11, and I saw a couple tweets where they're like, "Oh, we need to realize the reason that the terrorists did this is because they were striking up against the cis hetero patriarchy of the West." And I was like, "You have to be insane or just totally cynical and like obviously going for power grabs to think that's why they did 9/11." Because then today I listened to a podcast, a kind of a rough history about what happened, and it's like it's really more complicated than that, because we had been in the Middle East since like the 70s, and there's like the muhaji
Mujahideen.
muhajideen.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's Mujahideen.
they're thank it's the guys they thanked at the end of the first Rambo movie, but um, it's like this really complicated thing, and it's because these people have like they're not seeing the whole truth. They can only see it from one angle, where that's everything has to be looked through this lens, and there can't be any other reason. And I think the other example I've seen is, I don't know if you know this guy Kyle Kalinske.
Yeah, I
Um,
know.
yeah, I would just watched a video on a guy where he was like why he's wrong on Afghanistan, and like Kyle Kalinske is convinced that the only reason anyone is in Afghanistan right now is because of these like massive reserves of like lithium and other metals. And the guy broke it down and he's like, it takes decades to build mines and there aren't any mines there. You would think if we were going there for like these resources, we would have started building mines by now, for because we've been there for like 20 years. And even if it took 10 years to build, why didn't we start doing that? And like the actual mines are there are normally just like coal mines for like local people. And he broke it down and it's like, oh yeah, this guy is so convinced of a reason why we were doing something that he's not looking for other information, you know?
Yeah,
And that's kind of like that ideological possession where they have part of the truth, but they don't have the whole truth to see the whole world around them, you know?
right.
Kind of like what you were just saying.
Something it's discussions about just sort of even just the nature of truth that truly
Mhm.
like humbles me in terms of just the depth to which Dr. Peterson is able to think through a lot of these problems. Not just the depth, but how internally consistent it is. Another thing he's also said before too, and I think he's also actually quoting probably another famous European philosopher, is the idea that people don't have novel ideas. Like ideas possess
Mm.
people, and
Yeah.
it's like what the hell does that even mean? And it's like, okay, take it from the perspective of like the ancient Greeks. Like the Greeks believed that humans were the playthings of the gods, right? And what were
Yeah.
the gods? Gods were like the gods of love, the gods of lust, the god of war. And it's like, let's get a little on top of that. It's also like, let's get a little more sophisticated than on the definition of what a god or a deity is. A god or a deity is something that can't be killed, and it exists for all time. So if you take those labels off and then just like superimpose them within the problem, it's like, oh, lust, love, war, um, envy, rage, and all these other things like have always existed within the human mind for all of eternity, and they will still continue to be so for like millennia to come, right? And that's just because of the nature of human beings. So when you talk about like this idea that um, like these people have certain ideologies, and it's like, no, dude, like sometimes like the ideology possesses the people, and then suddenly the people serve to like exist to serve or facilitate or perpetuate and propagate like the existence of some of these ideologies too. It's absolutely crazy because it's like sometimes you'll see people be like, oh yeah, I'm very open to talking about to talking about people of different experiences, but the second they actually talk to someone of a different experience, it's almost like they become like these mouthpieces for like this like a certain political philosophy or ideology, and they start saying things that you probably know that they don't actually believe deep down inside, you know. And it's like
Yeah.
they just serve the existence of the ideology now. And it's and from I suppose a more psychological perspective too, that's also like the sort of idea of confirmation bias. It's like, oh, if you look at the world as if you were a hammer, you're going to think everything is a nail, right? If you're
Yeah.
looking for like validation of a certain perspective of your way of life, you're probably going to find ways to validate like certain things, to perpetuate like a specific narrative, even though it has nothing to do with the thing, right? They're total non sequiturs, but it's just something that's convenient and it sounds good enough for someone to believe. Um, and I think that needs a little more credit than what than what it's given right now, because I think a lot more people are sort of prone to it, and they serve that sort of um, meta narrative than they're really giving themselves credit to. And again, that goes back to the idea of oh, we lie to ourselves more often than we care to admit. And then
Yeah.
also obviously that goes back into the idea of what's like the meaning of truth.
Yeah. I think, and I think Peterson and Sam Harris had like two like several hour long debates on like what is truth and what is not, and like what we should constitute as like, I guess truth is almost a bad word for it because I think there's more than one type of truth when you start thinking about it. Like, I think there's like reality truth, like what's real, what's there, you know, this the sky is blue, the sun is in the sky, things like that are true. And then there's metaphorical truth, which is like this is true because of this reason, or there's, I guess that's not really truth. Like where you put your value structure is another sort of truth, but it's not really truth in the traditional sense, I would guess.
Right. I think it's also very important to almost like I think this is the reason why he places so much emphasis on just like the significance of not distorting language and like being
Yeah.
very specific with your definitions. And I suppose that's also another reason why he's such a staunch proponent, just not just for freedom of speech, but also protection against compelled speech too.
Yeah.
Because
Which is probably why he has a rule: be precise in your speech.
yeah, is that in this book? I can't remember.
I think it's rule 10, if I remember right.
Dang. Okay. Yeah. We're. Oh my god, that's crazy. I wasn't even like planning on like making that sort of segue, but like when he,
Yeah.
I think I just lost my train of thought.
Mm.
I think. Oh no no no. When I was in undergrad, I took this course called Intro to Logic, and I remember taking this. I was like, this is so stupid. Like, like why do I need to take a course about like what logic is? And it's sort of like also that same sort of thing that's funny where it's like if you're trying to make fun of like students of philosophy, what's like the first joke? It's like, oh, what does it mean to be true? Or like one of those like those like sort of memeable conversations where you just get very specific about the definitions. And the reason why
Mm.
that's like a meme is because it is true. It's really important to be specific about your definitions. Because on one hand, there's there's truth and then there's logic. Something having like truth, something being truthful sort of implies like the existence of this truth value. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
the sky is blue. That has truth value because it's consistent within the observable world, and other people can corroborate that, right?
Mm.
On mass, they can corroborate that sort of idea. And then there's also this idea of cogency, or like this idea of consistent logical thought process. What does that look like?
Yeah.
So for example, it's like, let's say let's say the moon is made of cheese. I eat cheese. Therefore, I can eat the moon. So it's almost like this sort of transitive property, right? But
Yeah.
just because something has a logical pattern to it doesn't mean it inherently has truth value, right? No
Yeah.
one knows what the moon is made out of unless you've been to the moon. Oh wait, we have been to the moon. It's made of a bunch of rocks. Is it cheese? No, we probably can't eat it. So it's like, while something
Yeah.
does have logical value, or like does make logical sense, and there's like a linear thought process that goes behind it, that doesn't mean there's necessarily a truth value. Now the problem arises where you take a fraction, you take a statement such as like the moon is made of cheese, and it's like, okay, you there's like a sliver of truth to it. Let's say there's edible parts to the moon. The
Mm.
cheese is also edible. Therefore, the edible parts of the moon must be cheese or something like that. You know? And it's like now suddenly you've created like this weird sort of this weird sort of like bastardized form of the truth that isn't entirely the truth, but also isn't entirely falsehood. You know? And I
Yeah.
think that happens so much right now. Not just I think it's easy to say that the media is like the most serious offender of it, but it's also another thing to say that just everyday human beings are like the most serious offenders of it too. Because how many times have you lied? Or like how many times have you like told like a little white lie with a fraction of the truth just to avoid like the consequences or repercussions of like possible punishment? I can
Mm.
I've done that at
Yeah.
least like
Yeah.
5 times this week, bro. Like
Yeah.
it's kind of embarrassing. I'm like,
Yeah.
wow. Like on one hand, I'm
You're
like, oh
like,
yes, it's important to tell the truth, but
yeah.
also at the same time, am I really doing my best? Probably
Yeah.
not.
It's like the classic example where it's like you admit you did something wrong, but then you lie about like the reasoning to get out of trouble. Where it's like,
Yeah,
oh yeah,
dude.
yeah, I did this thing, but it was because of this reason. And when it was really like a selfish reason or something, and you say like, oh, it's this, and it's like altruistic, and so then the person who would probably punish you or have a worse punishment if it was just selfish reason, you'd be like, oh well, you did it for a good reason, or you did it on you lie and you said I as an accident. Oh, okay, well, just don't do it again. Okay. you know?
Yeah, it's like also that phrase. I think anytime anyone gets caught like cheating in a relationship, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I caught you red-handed cheating with my best friend or whatever, and they say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and it's like, "Oh, are you sorry because you know you did something wrong, or are you sorry that you got caught?" You know. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of times, like, I think that's probably one of those, like, conversations like that are probably the ones where the offenders are, they have the easiest path to lie to themselves, because what's the
Yeah.
goal here? The goal is to seek peace. The goal is to avoid the repercussions. So you can almost fool yourself into believing that, oh, I I realized that I was wrong, and therefore I'm sorry because I know what I did was wrong. Versus, oh my god, like, I've been sitting on this lie for like such a long time. I know it's kind of wrong, but at the same time, I'm not going to come forward with the truth, because that way I'm bringing punishment upon myself, right? So now it's like, how
Yeah.
sorry really am I if I'm not willing to be proactive with the truth? I think that's another thing too. That's kind of not just interesting, but also incredibly difficult, and something that I think this chapter sort of, I think in some ways it fails to address, is like being proactive with the truth, you know? Because I think a lot of times, like,
Yeah.
within this chapter, it's like the truth comes knocking at your door, and then you have to make your peace with whether or not you're gonna speak truth or false, truly or falsely, versus,
Yeah.
oh, I know I did something wrong. I fucked up really bad. I'm gonna wait until like the bells toll for me to admit my wrongs, or
Yeah.
I don't know. What's your perspective of that? When do you think it's
Um,
necessary, or do you think it's always necessary to be proactive with the truth when you know that you are wrong?
well, I think that's what we kind of talked about this earlier. What it was going into, I think, when what it was, we talked about where you have to like draw lines early, and I made a note, and it's like you need to draw lines early and clearly. I think that's what we were talking about earlier with the like Aziz Ansari kind of example, where if you're uncomfortable with the situation, you need to draw that line earlier, before it builds up. Um, so then, yeah, I think he kind of talks about like setting these new unnecessary counterproductive rules in the workplace, but you don't say anything at this time. And then like more and more rules build up, and then suddenly the whole thing kind of becomes corrupt. And I was kind of thinking about that, where kind of lost what the prompt was for this um, thought, but I remember I was working a job in undergrad at a pool, and I remember like I was only supposed to be working like 20 hours a week because I was part time, but I kept consistently getting scheduled more and more hours because we were so short staffed. And at first I was like, oh, whatever, it's just 21 hours or it's just 22 hours. So I was like, oh, it's not like that big of a deal. A lot of times it was just like, oh, I had to stay like 15 minutes longer for three or for like four shifts. So I didn't draw that line earlier, but then it started getting closer and closer and started like cutting down on my study time and other time that I could be using. But at that point, I was working so many extra hours. I hadn't drawn that line, and it was really hard to kind of push back and be like, no, wait, I can't work this many hours. And every time I would start complaining about it, nothing would really change because I had let it go on for so long that
Mm.
it had kind of been corrupted in that system. And I think everyone kind of sees this, where there's just kind of this slow creep of corruption, which I know Jordan Peterson's talked about this too, where every hierarchy is prone to slowly corrupt. And I think that's what he was getting with the end of the chapter with it's not Osiris, it was who's the god of culture? Um or is it Osiris? Was it right?
I think it is Osiris, because he talks about Horus, Osiris, and Set.
Yeah, so like that things tend to get corrupted, and I think the reason is because we're not being honest or drawing those lines early enough to stop corruption from creeping in earlier.
Yeah, I think that requires not just like incredible presence of, like, incredible willpower, but also presence of mind to acknowledge the difficulty of having such a conversation about the mere meaning of truth, right? Because
Mm.
you look at, I think almost the most easily recognizable examples is like if you take a certain example or if you take a certain conundrum, remove the labels of it, and then put that within the confines of like a relationship that's like an intimate relationship, whether it's with your family, your spouse, your girlfriend, your boyfriend. Say you've been like your spouse doesn't like clean the dishes for like weeks, and you're stuck doing them for like months to years, and then
Mm.
suddenly you're like, okay, enough is enough. I hate it when you don't clean up after yourself. Let's say that's a conversation you're having with your partner, and it's like, oh well, you've been complicit with this all this time. Like there'll be times where I notice you'll just do my dishes for me, even though I know
Mhm.
like I haven't done them for a week or something like that. And it's like, why is this coming up right now? Typically, it's like when other issues also come to pass, such that like the sum total of all the issues becomes unbearable to the point where the entire system just destabilizes and sort of collapses in on itself, right? Because hardly ever is it just one issue, and hardly ever does one issue merely only represent that one singular issue. That issue typically is more reflective or indicative of the existence of more complicated yet similar issues with similar like ideologies and similar roots, right? So I think when you look at it from that perspective, it's also like easier to sort of grasp that the idea that, oh, man-made systems, or like systems that are based upon certain philosophies or certain practices that ultimately develop certain aspects of culture and tradition, are inevitable to be uh, destabilized, corrupted, or collapse. And they may go through like those cycles, like, and they may wax and wane, and like the pendulum may swing one way or the other. Now the problem within that too is that like sometimes like the pendulum takes hundreds of years to swing back, and then sometimes it doesn't do it at all. um
Or
so
the correction is a I was gonna say, or the correction is a violent revolution, which
yes,
I can't
yes.
remember if that was mentioned in this chapter or
No, it's in this
somewhere
chapter.
else. Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I always meant to, if I think that's one of the questions I would put on a short list of like if I was ever at a Jordan Peterson thing, and with the Q&A at the end, if I could ask a question, be like, okay, well, what's the solution to fixing the culture when it's gone too far without a bloody revolution? Because A, I wouldn't want a violent revolution, and B, there's no guarantee that the violent revolution would end with a with fixing this corruption that we currently have. You know, it
Yeah.
maybe the violent revolution is like the Soviet Russia or Mao's China or Cambodia. Like, and in the end, it's either worse or it never really corrects or it just becomes a different corrupt institution. So, like, what's the answer? Because I feel like right now, I think we are kind of in that on the edge of either we have to swing back with our pendulum in the US or there's like I wouldn't say we're close to any sort of I don't want to go like full doomer, we're on the edge of civil war, but I think we're slowly getting there where there's enough unease that something is going to snap or we'll just swing the other way and not really fix anything, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what do you think that looks like? If you were to paint me a picture what uh, of what that possible future could potentially look like, do you think people would be like congregating on like Facebook, like with groups and stuff, saying like, oh, we're gonna march here because we know like the Democrats or
Mm.
the Republicans are gonna be marching here too, and we're just gonna yell at each other, and then just to the point where like fist fights break out, and then suddenly like fist fights or like gun violence or explosions and stuff sort of just break out like throughout the states. Do you think something like that could happen?
I mean, obviously, I think it's hypothetically true because in recent history we have, like all the BLM riots, which is on the one which I would say is typically one side of the aisle, and then we had January 6th, which fortunately it was only a one-time event, and I think BLM kind of riot type stuff is like really settled down for the most part, but who's to say that it doesn't erupt again because of the next George Floyd event or the next event that kind of triggers the right side, which yeah, because obviously there's a path we go down where that kind of happens. But like I said, I don't want to be, oh, we're on an imminent civil war. I think it would take a long time for something like that to happen. For one, that I think, fortunately, most people who have violent revolutionary tendencies don't have the power to enact them right now. You know, we don't have violent revolutionaries in Congress, I would say. I don't think anyone in Congress. There might be one or two, but there's not enough to be there. Where you see people online where they're either outright calling for revolution or kind of I think the wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of people.
Yeah, I think another thing too is
Which
that
is why I
like
don't think we're on any sort of. Oh, sorry. All I was gonna say is that's why I don't think we're on any sort of imminent like revolution or anything, because it's not culturally acceptable at this point for there to be politically violence. So all the people who would be in support of that all have to be kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I think we talked about. I think I brought it up last week, but that is Vosh unironically evil video. I think I sent to you and you
yeah,
watched
yeah.
it, where he he kind of goes. He's like, you know how I say I don't think, but we all know it's kind of a joke. Where it's like, yeah, I think that's why I don't think we're on any sort of imminent collapse, but there is a future where that does happen, and I don't know what the solution is to kind of correct things without either just swinging back in some other direction, or I guess the least violent solution without would be maybe like several states seceding or something. I don't know because obviously I don't know enough about the solution or problems to
I think that
make
yeah,
predictions,
I
but
think the infrastructure. Well, sans like several like forgettable states like the Dakotas or like I don't know. I guess like Montana. No offense to like listeners from any of those states,
yeah,
but it's like you hardly ever people saying like, oh, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna take the kids to Idaho. you know,
yeah,
but instead of
yeah,
like Disney World or something, you know. Um, but no, I think it's difficult because typically states that have that sort of swing power, like if they were to secede, it's like so much of like the infrastructure of the United States is like based on like certain states being good at certain things, right? So like a lot of the Midwestern
mm,
states are like dedicated to like agriculture and like trade industries,
yeah,
like mass manufacturing. Like I'm pretty sure almost like 98% of like all cardboard boxes used for shipping and handling come from Ohio.
hmm,
And then like basically all the dairy comes from like Minnesota and Wisconsin or something like that, right? Most of the dairy products at least. And then it's like
yeah,
entertainment comes from California. Business and finance are largely centered in like I don't know places like Chicago, New York, Atlanta, stuff like you know, it's like so much of our way of life is so intertwined to the point where I feel as though that we have no choice but to come to like either finding a meaningful like long-term solution or just sweeping the issue under the rug. And I think the latter is
yeah,
what like for the most part most politicians have been doing for a while by like sort of playing possum with a lot of other issues that don't actually matter. And I think the media has sort of I think the media is probably like the worst offender of perpetuating such things, right? Because the media isn't so much like in the business of telling the truth. It's like the media is in the business of broadcasting a certain
yeah,
aspect of certain truths. So it's tough, and the funny thing, or at least you know the grave humor that I find in this too, is that if a civil war were to like sort of erupt, and I don't condone any sort of violence. I'm not. I hope people don't take this the wrong way too. But you start to ask yourself like, who, like of people of certain political philosophies or ideologies, who is like more likely to own guns? Like who is more likely to have more violent like proclivities or be better trained or something like that.
Yeah.
And like the answer is kind of clear to me. And it's like I don't think people like a lot of people that are like of the opposite end of the aisle are willing to like play that game, if you know what I mean. You know, so I think
Yeah.
I think the grounds of cultural of warfare within the United States are more going to be cultural, and we're already seeing that too. And that's like what cancel culture. You know, people can't get jobs because they said like bad words in certain things. They didn't wear a mask in like
When they were
in Walgreens or something.
they said the N word when they were 12, so now they can't get a job.
Yeah,
5 years from retirement,
or,
you know?
or they took like a sultry photo like on their MySpace page back in like 2002, and like someone's reposting that, and they're like, "Oh, you want this bitch to like be a lawyer or something or whatever?"
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's like let people be people, you know, and I think that's the most difficult part. Sometimes like we exist so much in like these circles of like media to the point where we forget sometimes like the reality of the situation is just the human experience, right? Just the things that all humans are like prone to doing and are inevitable to do for like the remainder of time. What is that? Hypocrisy, not self-criticism, but like self-contradiction, like things like that. People like hardly ever do you see people that are like rock solid, internally consistent. And it's like, give us a break, man. You know, like the other day I was like, what's like one food that I could eat for the rest of my life? And I was like, probably a Chipotle burrito. And then this week I had like 3 Chipotle burritos, and I was like, yeah, I'm sick of this. I was like, oh, maybe I'd like pho like every day for the rest of my life. And then I had it like twice in a month, and I'm like, okay, that's enough for me for about another month and a half.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's strange.
I think if we go back to kind of being that, going back to truth and the nature of it, and I think the reason why I say we're not anywhere near any sort of violent revolution or anything is because I think part of it is people have this underlying sense that the hyperbole isn't true, you know? Because I feel like if people actually thought some of the things you see online, which I think I'm online way too much, so it kind of skews your vision of what the average Joe is actually experiencing in real life, where I think if you actually thought that the US was literally run by a crypto fascist for 4 years and now is being literally run by like a crypto socialist or a man who doesn't realize he's being secretly manipulated by socialists behind the scenes, like, yeah, then I would think revolution would be justifiable. But I think most people realize that that's not actual truth, but it feels good to kind of live with that lie almost. And that's why I think it's not as bad as it seems. But then I guess, and then it does make it hard to kind of sift out the actual truth and realize where you need to draw lines about certain lies or certain values you have versus what is just hyperbole.
Do you think the discovery or the pursuit of truth is what is more important than that? So the reason I'm sort of asking that too is like earlier in this conversation we talked about like we could have like, I think we're talking about vaccines and like mandates because I sent you that Z-Dog video, and it was like it's like, yes, it would be undeniable the benefit to public health from a COVID perspective of initiating like a vaccine mandate for every citizen of the United States, right? But obviously, like when you institute such a draconian rule, you also have to ask yourself like, what's like the cost? Like at what cost? And then the cost becomes like the free will of people to make their own choices for their own health. And I think something that I've heard too from other people is like, oh, like the lives of innocent human beings and whatever are always more valuable than like your individual freedoms. And sometimes I'm like, is it? Because I feel as though sometimes we fall in love with like the idea of like human life versus like the actual meaning of life itself. It's like you look at someone who's like in a vegetative state for like a decade. who's like clearly miserable. Let's say they're like in their 50s, terrible traumatic
Yeah.
brain injury. They're stuck on like a bed and they have to get turned like every 5 minutes. Otherwise, like they have this ulcer on their butt that's just gonna like slowly infect and kill them, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, what kind of life is that? And it's like, what kind of life would we have if we didn't have like freedom of choice and freedom of speech too? It's like
Yeah.
limitations on the freedom of life sort of detract or like diminish the meaning of life itself. So there's this weird balance that we have to have where we're like I think the three virtues that the founding fathers like fought to defend are what? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And then someone once
Mm.
told me that like those things are placed in the order of their significance too. And the more I think about it, is
Yeah.
I'm like, sometimes I feel like the first two things are almost like sort of on the same level. What is that? Life and freedom. Because it's like when you have
Yeah.
freedom, you sort of also initiate like the uh, freedom enables you to have like the freedom to have conflict too, right? And
Mm.
ultimately, I think having healthy conflict, meaningful conflict, is how you find also meaningful peace too. But sometimes like that's
Yeah.
that's also not the case. Sometimes like healthy conflict is not realistic, and sometimes that it just devolves into violent chaos, right? So I sort of ask that again too. Like, at what point does like the at what point does like sort of the pursuit of truth, or like what sort in what circumstances is like the pursuit of truth the lesser of two options? Would you say?
Which point is the pursuit of truth?
Like less meaningful than the pursuit of something else, like the preservation of life, or like the preservation of, um, yeah, let's say
Oh, I
preservation of
see.
life.
I see. I see. So if, I guess you're kind of making an analogy to like when is the noble, the concept of the noble lie.
Yes, yes,
When
yes.
when when is that actual applicable? Which I don't think I've ever seen a good example of the noble lie working. I think every time it's always in like media the wrong choice, which because I think The Dark Knight Rises might not be the best movie, but like the noble lie is used against Batman and Gotham in that movie. So it's like, oh, maybe it's not the best. Which, yeah, I was kind of thinking about the nature of truth too, where um, I think it's kind of undeniable that certain public health or not policies, but like certain public health messages have been straight up. I think people have admitted to the mask one being a lie. Where early in the pandemic, Dr. Fauci said
To wear two
he said
masks or something like that.
I think he said masks are ineffective, and he knew that they were probably effective, or at least he thought they were. And the reason why he said they weren't effective, and people shouldn't need them is so that there wouldn't be a run on masks like there was for like toilet paper and other stuff.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Oh,
So
wow.
like, so I think typically I don't think there can ever be a situation where the truth is not effective, because you're going to have a situation like that where now it's kind of discredited. And I think Dr. Fauci is probably correct on 80 to 90% of the things he said. And if he had just been honest with the things where he was either not sure about, um or he wasn't like lying to like the masks thing, I think if he had just like come out and said, we wouldn't have as much issues with people right now thinking he's lying about so many things. Where because I think you see just like these montages of him kind of flip-flopping between different positions, and you're just like, if this guy had just come out and said, like, for at least a good chunk of time, where he's like, we're not sure, this is the best data we have, it seems to be going this direction, but I can't make a definitive statement, but here's what I think at this time, I think that would have made solved so many problems. To either not lie, which tell the truth, or at least not lie
Right.
about the situation. Um, because now there's so many things where now I think there's been recent studies that say natural infection might be better than vaccine immunity, but he can't. It seems like he can't go back on the statement already that everyone needs to get vaccinated, because then it would make it sound like a lie or something, where we could have like an intelligent, honest conversation and be like, oh, well, if you got COVID, the studies seem to say that you're probably better immune than the vaccine. So maybe we'll just get a way for you to prove that you had COVID, rather than having to submit your vaccine card to anything that you need for, like school or work or whatever's requiring it. You can just show that you had a positive COVID test at some point in your life and you're good. Stuff like that, where I don't think I can think of a situation where lying, it may be good in the short term, but in the long run, it probably wouldn't, because it'll discredit you in general, so that you might be able to say truths in the future, but always either in the back of their head, they'll be like, oh, this guy might be lying to me now, or you have to fight back against so many lies that you can't even get to the actual truth of the conversation. I think people are going to realize how much Destiny I've been watching, but he's definitely had this issue where he's starting to get more and more frustrated with people who are, quote, on his side of the aisle, like kind of left wing, because of so much misinformation. Where he's like, yeah, I have to talk to my conservative mom, and I have to start like 20 steps back because I have to dispel and agree with her on how many of the lies and misinformation that are going out before I can actually get to the actual truth and why I think she should be doing a thing. So I don't think there's a situation where lying would be useful in the long run.
I think and this is something that I was trying to like sort of wrestle with too while you were talking, is that like I
Mm,
think perhaps for me, like the time where telling the truth would not be the most effective actually even, and this is still something I'm trying to work out for myself too, is that if you can't accept the responsibility for telling the truth, right? So it's
mm,
like, if we were to take that example of trying to mitigate like the demand, like the instant demand for masks, and taking that
yeah,
away from like its availability and accessibility to like healthcare providers, I think if you weren't able to adequately prepare for such an outcome, then it's not. I think telling the truth may not, like that's like the one instance where I think that may not be the best solution, because at that point it's like if
mm,
we were to take it to like the logical extreme, it's like everyone is like out to save themselves and like out to like find their own masks and stuff, and it's like if you do that, and then like the supply chain um, for healthcare providers is just crippled like that, well, then what happens? You've effectively eliminated like the last line of defense for like these people that are on the front lines trying to like cure
yeah,
people of disease when it's their responsibility, right? And it's like if you do tell the truth then, and you're unable to like not just like accept the responsibility, but adequately prepare for a future where you do accept the responsibility, then I think it's inefficient then. I think then the possibility of the noble lie is almost sort of, I don't want to say sanctioned, because then I feel like it's easier to get it. That's like when you opened. It's like trying to put toothpaste back into the tube, right? It's so easy to
yeah,
just push the limits of that to like to anything that like sort of behooves or like serves like a certain narrative. So I think,
yeah,
and that's still something I have to like sort of think out too, where you can't accept the responsibility or accept the reality or adequately prepare for the future where you do accept the responsibility too. Because
yeah,
I think in some ways people did sort of deserve to have like their faith rewarded, but at the same time it's like that's
mm,
that the rate at which that just slips into both tyranny and also totalitarianism is just so precipitous, and it's like so exponential to the point where it's like
yeah,
sometimes even just to protect to protect people from like an even worse future that is just inevitable is to like just bite the bullet now and accept that a lot of bad things are going to happen, right? It's like, oh, he's going to say that about like not buying masks, then he should also equally accept the responsibility of, oh, I may not get masks for myself and my family, and that has to be like, not that it's not that it has
yeah,
to be okay, but I have to accept that as a reality, and I can't get better about it, because otherwise that's just corruption. That's just like self-preservation, no matter how noble a cause he's trying to facilitate. And this is by no means like an attack on Fauci. Like
yeah,
I'm just trying to like explore this idea and get to the bottom of it. But
yeah. Because if we went through that specific example, I would say rather than lying and saying, "Oh, masks are ineffective," and then like either tell another lie later, where it's like, "Oh, the data's in now, the masks work. Once your supply lines are secure," I would say the answer is tell the truth and be like, "Oh, masks are effective, especially like N95s or whatever." But then either hope that the public can deal with the hey, we need these for frontline workers and hope that people can be altruistic, or you need to be smart and be like, oh, well, we're going to purposely divert mass that would generally be going to the public to public like health providers.
I think in
Kind of
that
using,
instance, yeah, I think in that instance, that's where the second half of the rule becomes like the most
yeah,
saliently true, where it's like you at least should not lie, because if you do lie,
mm,
then you effectively discredited yourself from like just being
yeah,
like an emissary, or like yeah, just an emissary for truth, right? Because now it's like it's the same thing that people are criticizing Fauci for now. He's just being dishonest and not telling us the full truth, or like manipulating the truth, you know. So it's
mm,
it's challenging.
yep.
But yeah, that was a great conversation. That was a great discussion.
Hmm.
If y'all have anything, like interesting to say, you know, I think we don't have too many views going on right now. But you know,
Nope.
truth be told, I'll probably be the one watching these the most, like in the future. So like,
Yeah.
throw some comments down below. For any of our fans, I think one of like 4 fans right now. You know, just hit us up down below, and you know, we're always down to have these sorts of conversations. I think this was our best one yet so far. So
Yeah.
thanks everyone for tuning in if you did, and we'll talk to you next week where we're discussing Rule 9.